The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when the knock came. It was past 11 at night, and Caleb Moore was securing a loose shutter on the back porch of his small house in Cedar Falls, Iowa. His 9-year-old son Ethan was already asleep upstairs, wrapped in blankets with a flashlight beside his bed in case the power went out again. The storm had knocked out electricity twice already. When Caleb heard the knocking, urgent and desperate against his front door, he grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and made his way through the dark hallway. He opened the door to find a woman he had never spoken to but recognized immediately. Rachel Whitmore stood on his porch, soaked through her expensive coat, clutching a small girl against her chest. The child was maybe 7 years old, shivering, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. Rachel's voice broke when she spoke. She asked if they could come inside, just until the storm passed, just for a few hours. She said her daughter was cold. Caleb looked at the little girl's trembling shoulders and stepped aside without a word. He did not invite them in because of who Rachel was. He invited them in because of the fear in that child's eyes. Caleb Moore had lived in Cedar Falls his entire life. He was born in the same hospital where his wife had died 7 years ago, 3 weeks after giving birth to Ethan. Her name was Sarah, and she had been the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like they mattered. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school and spent her summers volunteering at the animal shelter. She had developed complications that no one saw coming, and by the time the doctors realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Caleb had been 29 years old, holding a newborn son in one arm and signing paperwork for his wife's funeral with the other hand. The grief had been so total, so complete, that he sometimes forgot how to breathe. He never remarried. He never even dated. People in town tried to set him up with single mothers and widowed neighbors, but he always declined with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. He threw himself into raising Ethan and building his small electrical contracting business, taking jobs around town, fixing wiring in old houses, installing ceiling fans, replacing outdated panels in buildings that had not been updated since his grandfather's time. He was good at his work, reliable, quiet. People in Cedar Falls trusted him because he showed up when he said he would and never overcharged. He knew the history of every house in town, knew which foundations had settled and which roofs had been patched too many times. He lived in the house his parents had left him, a 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch that needed painting every few years and a backyard oak tree that Ethan loved to climb. The mortgage was paid off. The truck in the driveway was 12 years old but ran fine because Caleb maintained it religiously every Saturday morning. He did not want much from life anymore. He wanted Ethan to be safe and healthy and grow up knowing he was loved. He wanted to sleep through the night without dreaming about the hospital, about Sarah's pale face against white sheets, about the way her hand had gone limp in his. He wanted to be left alone with his memories and his routines and his small, careful life. Rachel Whitmore was the opposite of everything Caleb represented. She was the CEO of Whitmore Industries, a manufacturing company her grandfather had founded 60 years ago when Cedar Falls was still a farming community with dirt roads and a single general store. The company employed nearly 400 people in the region and had contracts with automotive suppliers across the Midwest. Rachel had taken over 5 years ago after her father's stroke, stepping into a boardroom full of men who had known her since she was a child in pigtails and did not believe she could lead them. She had proved every one of them wrong. Under her leadership, the company had grown its revenue by 40%. She had modernized the production facilities, implemented new safety protocols, and negotiated contracts that secured jobs for the next decade. She was featured in regional business magazines with headlines about female leadership in manufacturing. She sat on the boards of 3 charitable foundations. She drove a black Mercedes that she washed herself every Sunday because she did not trust anyone else to do it properly. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, Rachel was just a mother trying to keep her daughter safe. Her 7-year-old Lucy had been asleep when Rachel made the decision to leave. The little girl had her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin. She loved horses and hated broccoli and asked questions about everything. Why the sky was blue and where birds went in winter and what happened to people when they died. Rachel had wrapped Lucy in a blanket and carried her to the car, driving through the storm with no clear destination, just the desperate need to get away. Her ex-husband Marcus had been calling all day, leaving messages that sounded calm on the surface but carried threats underneath. He was flying in from Chicago. He wanted to discuss the custody arrangement. He wanted to see his daughter. Rachel knew what that meant. It meant lawyers and private investigators and court dates that stretched on for months. It meant Lucy being pulled apart by two people who were supposed to love her more than they loved their own pride. Inside Caleb's house, the contrast between the two adults was sharp and immediate. Rachel stood in the hallway, dripping water onto the hardwood floor, her designer coat ruined, her carefully styled hair plastered to her face like seaweed. She looked smaller than she did in the photographs that appeared in the local newspaper, where she was always shown standing tall behind a podium or shaking hands with important people. Here, in the dim light of a stranger's hallway, she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The circles under her eyes spoke of weeks without proper sleep. The tension in her shoulders suggested muscles that had forgotten how to relax. Caleb brought towels from the bathroom and handed one to Rachel without comment. He knelt down in front of Lucy and spoke to her gently, his voice soft in a way that surprised Rachel. He asked if she wanted some hot chocolate. The little girl looked at her mother for permission before nodding, and there was something in that gesture, the seeking of approval before accepting kindness, that made Caleb's chest tighten. While Caleb heated milk on the gas stove, adding chocolate powder and a pinch of cinnamon the way Sarah used to make it, he could hear movement upstairs. Ethan appeared on the staircase a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes, his pajamas wrinkled from sleep, his hair stuck up in all directions. He saw Lucy sitting at the kitchen table and paused, processing this unexpected development with the serious expression that always reminded Caleb of Sarah. Then he asked if Lucy wanted to see his collection of baseball cards. Within 10 minutes, the two children were sitting on the living room floor, sorting through cardboard boxes of cards while the storm raged outside. They were laughing about something, their voices mixing with the sound of rain against windows. Rachel watched them from the kitchen doorway with an expression that Caleb recognized. It was the look of a parent who had forgotten what normal felt like, who had been so consumed by crisis that ordinary moments seemed miraculous. Rachel finally spoke when the children were occupied. She apologized for showing up unannounced. She said she did not know where else to go. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking around the coffee mug Caleb had placed in front of her. Caleb told her she did not need to explain anything, but Rachel seemed to need to talk, needed to release the pressure that had been building inside her for months. She told him that she and Marcus had divorced 2 years ago. The marriage had been over long before that, held together by business partnerships and social obligations, and the naive hope that having a child would fix what was broken between them. Marcus came from old money, Chicago money, the kind of wealth that assumed it could purchase anything, including loyalty. He had not wanted the divorce. He had not wanted to lose access to the Whitmore family fortune, the connections, the prestige of being married to a woman whose name was on buildings and charity galas. The custody battle had been brutal. Lawyers who billed $800 an hour, depositions that lasted for days, private investigators who dug through Rachel's garbage and photographed her leaving work at midnight. Marcus's team had tried to paint her as an absentee mother, too focused on her career to properly raise a child. They had brought in experts to testify about the importance of paternal influence. They had questioned Rachel's mental fitness, suggesting that her dedication to the company was actually an obsession that bordered on pathology. Rachel had won primary custody, but the victory had felt hollow. Marcus had visitation rights, and he had been using those rights as leverage ever since, threatening to take her back to court, claiming she was an unfit mother because she worked too many hours, because she traveled for business, because she had once missed Lucy's school play due to a meeting that ran late. Tonight, something had changed. Marcus had called to say he was coming to Cedar Falls early. He was not supposed to arrive until next week. Rachel had heard something in his voice that frightened her, a cold satisfaction that suggested he knew something she did not. She had grabbed Lucy and run. The storm continued through the night, rain lashing the windows like angry fists demanding entry. Caleb checked on the children every hour, tiptoeing across the creaking floorboards with practiced silence. They had fallen asleep on the living room floor, surrounded by baseball cards and the blankets Caleb had brought down from the linen closet. Lucy had her thumb in her mouth, a habit Rachel had been trying to break. Ethan had one arm thrown protectively across a pillow, the same way he slept in his own bed. Looking at them together, their small bodies curled toward each other like plants seeking light, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Rachel had moved to the couch, where she sat staring at her phone, waiting for it to ring or not ring, uncertain which would be worse. At some point, around 2 in the morning, a car drove slowly past the house. Rachel sat up straight, her entire body rigid with fear. Caleb watched from the window as the headlights swept across the front yard, illuminating the rain-soaked grass and the old mailbox that needed replacing. The car did not stop. It continued down the street and turned the corner into darkness. But the damage was done. Rachel's hands were trembling again. She told Caleb that Marcus had people who worked for him, investigators, men who found things out, men who followed people and photographed license plates and tracked credit card purchases. Caleb asked her directly what she was running from. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal to this stranger who had opened his door to her without question. Then she answered honestly. She said she was running from a man who had never hit her, but had made her afraid of every shadow. She was running from a legal system that treated wealth as evidence of good parenting. She was running from the possibility that she might lose her daughter to someone who saw Lucy as a possession rather than a person, a trophy to be won rather than a child to be loved. Caleb thought about his own son sleeping on the floor 10 feet away. He thought about what he would do if someone tried to take Ethan away from him. If lawyers and judges and men in expensive suits decided he was not fit to raise his own child. He thought about the quiet life he had built in the 7 years since Sarah died, the deliberate distance he maintained from anything complicated or dangerous, the walls he had constructed around his heart to keep the grief from drowning him. Then, he looked at Lucy's small face, peaceful in sleep, her cheeks still flushed from crying earlier, and he made a decision. He told Rachel she could stay as long as she needed. He told her the couch folded out into a bed. He told her there was food in the refrigerator and clean towels in the bathroom and a lock on the front door that he would check twice before going to sleep. Rachel started to cry, not loud sobs, just silent tears running down her face like the rain outside. She whispered, "Thank you." Caleb nodded and went upstairs to check the windows, to give her privacy with her tears. The next morning broke gray and wet, the storm reduced to a steady drizzle that painted the world in shades of silver. Caleb was making pancakes when Ethan came into the kitchen, still wearing his pajamas, his feet bare against the cold floor. The boy stopped in the doorway, suddenly remembering that there were guests in the house. He looked at his father with a question in his eyes, the kind of look children give when they sense that adult matters are unfolding around them. Caleb told him that Lucy and her mom needed a place to stay for a little while, that they were friends who needed help. Ethan nodded seriously, accepting this information the way children accept things that adults would find complicated. He asked if Lucy could have breakfast with them. When Rachel came downstairs a few minutes later, her face still puffy from sleep and tears, she found both children sitting at the table, arguing passionately about whether chocolate chips or blueberries made better pancakes. Ethan insisted on chocolate. Lucy was firmly in the blueberry camp. Rachel looked at Caleb with something close to wonder. He just handed her a cup of coffee and returned to the stove. The first sign of trouble came that afternoon. Caleb had taken his truck to pick up supplies from the hardware store, leaving Rachel and the children at the house with strict instructions to keep the doors locked. When he returned, old Mrs. Patterson from next door was standing on his porch, making conversation with Rachel through the screen door. Mrs. Patterson was 73 years old and knew everything that happened in Cedar Falls within hours of it happening. She ran an informal intelligence network more sophisticated than anything the government could devise, piecing together fragments of gossip into complete pictures of everyone's business. She asked Rachel pointed questions about where she was staying and how long she planned to be in the neighborhood, and whether she knew that Caleb had been alone since poor Sarah passed. Rachel answered politely but vaguely, giving nothing away. After Mrs. Patterson left, promising to bring over a casserole tomorrow, Rachel told Caleb that someone had been asking questions at the gas station that morning. A man in a gray suit, driving a rental car with Illinois plates. He had shown the clerk a photograph and asked if anyone had seen the woman in it. The clerk, a teenage boy named Danny, who Caleb had known since he was in diapers, since he had rewired the kid's grandmother's kitchen 5 years ago, had said no. But he had texted Caleb immediately afterward, because people in small towns looked out for each other, because Danny knew Caleb had visitors. The whole town would know by nightfall. There were no secrets in Cedar Falls, only different degrees of public knowledge. Rachel's phone rang while the children were watching a movie in the living room, their bodies pressed together on the couch under a shared blanket. She looked at the screen and her face went pale. She walked into the kitchen before answering, but Caleb could hear her voice through the thin walls. She was speaking to someone named Gerald, her lawyer. The conversation was brief and tense. When she hung up, she stood at the kitchen sink for a long moment, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She told Caleb that Marcus had filed an emergency motion for custody. He was claiming that Rachel had kidnapped Lucy by leaving town without his permission. The hearing was scheduled for Monday. That was 4 days away. Rachel said that Gerald was good, one of the best family lawyers in the state, a man who had spent 30 years fighting custody battles. But Marcus had resources that seemed unlimited. He had hired investigators who had been following Rachel for months. They had photographs of her leaving work late. They had records of business trips. They had statements from people Rachel thought were friends, co-workers who had been paid to say she was distracted and irritable and possibly unstable. Everything she had done in the past 2 years was being assembled into a portrait of an absent mother, a woman too focused on her career to raise a child properly. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Rachel finished, the kitchen heavy with silence, he asked her a simple question. He asked if she was a good mother. Rachel looked startled by the directness. She started to list her failures, the missed recitals and forgotten permission slips, the business calls during bedtime, the nights when she came home too exhausted to do more than kiss Lucy goodnight and collapse into bed. The guilt poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Caleb stopped her. He asked again, was she a good mother? Rachel was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on something outside the window that only she could see. Then she said yes. She said she loved Lucy more than she had ever loved anything in her life. She said that every decision she made, every late night at the office, every difficult negotiation, was about building something that Lucy could inherit. Not just money, but a legacy. A company that treated its workers fairly, a business that would outlast them both. Caleb nodded slowly. He told her that was the only answer that mattered. That evening, after the children were asleep in their makeshift beds on the living room floor, a car pulled up in front of Caleb's house and parked at the curb. It sat there for 30 minutes without anyone getting out. The windows were tinted so dark that nothing inside was visible. The engine was running, a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet street. Caleb watched from the living room window, his hand resting on the baseball bat he kept beside the front door, the same bat Ethan used in Little League practice. Rachel sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, making herself as small as possible. Neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall ticked through the minutes with agonizing slowness. Finally, the car pulled away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. But they both knew it would be back. Marcus was not trying to hide anymore. He was making sure they knew he was watching. The next morning, Caleb woke before dawn and made a decision. He called his friend Tom, who worked as a deputy sheriff, and owed Caleb 3 favors from poker games and helped moves. He called his cousin Linda, who was a paralegal at the county courthouse and knew every judge by first name. He called 3 of his neighbors, the ones he trusted, the ones who had brought casseroles when Sarah died and had never expected anything in return, and asked them to keep an eye on his house. Then he drove to the electronics store in the next town and bought 4 security cameras, spending money he had been saving for a new water heater. He spent the afternoon installing them around his property, one facing the street, one covering the backyard, 2 pointed at the doors. His hands were steady with the work, the familiar motions of running wires and mounting brackets calming the anxiety that had been building in his chest. Rachel watched him work without commenting, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. When he finished, sweating despite the cool air, he showed her how to access the footage on his laptop. She asked him why he was doing all this, why he was putting himself and his son at risk for people he barely knew. Caleb considered the question carefully before answering. He told her that he did not like bullies. He told her that he had spent his whole life in this town, minding his own business, staying out of other people's problems, building his walls higher every year since Sarah died. But there were some things a person could not ignore. 2 children sleeping on his living room floor, their trust absolute and unearned. A mother who was scared of her own phone ringing. These things demanded action. These things demanded that he become someone braver than the man he had been. On Saturday evening, Caleb was washing dishes when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was Chicago. He dried his hands on a towel and answered. The voice on the other end was smooth and confident. A voice accustomed to getting what it wanted, to speaking in boardrooms where everyone agreed with whatever it said. Marcus introduced himself as if they were meeting at a business function, all charm and false warmth. He said he understood that Caleb had been helping Rachel. He said he appreciated the kindness but wanted to clear up some misunderstandings. His tone was reasonable, almost friendly. He talked about the complexity of divorce, the difficulty of co-parenting, the importance of children having relationships with both parents. He spoke about fathers' rights and legal obligations and the best interests of the child, using phrases that sounded rehearsed, polished by expensive consultants. Then his voice changed slightly, dropping a register into something colder. He mentioned that he had looked into Caleb's business. He noted that Caleb's electrical license was up for renewal next month. He observed that the contracting business in small towns depended heavily on reputation, on word of mouth, on people trusting you enough to enter their homes and access their walls and touch their wiring. He never made a direct threat. He did not need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caleb waited until Marcus finished speaking. Then he asked a single question, his voice calm and steady in a way that surprised even himself. He asked if Marcus knew that there were 4 children in this house right now. 2 of them were playing video games in the next room, their laughter audible through the door. 2 of them were the reason this conversation was happening. He told Marcus that those children could hear everything through these walls. He told Marcus that whatever he said next, whatever threats he made or implied, those children would remember it. They would carry it with them into adulthood, this memory of how their fathers behaved when things got difficult. He told Marcus that he himself was just an electrician from Iowa, nobody important, nobody with lawyers or investigators or money to burn on vengeance. But he knew something about fathers. He knew that a real father did not use his children as weapons in wars of his own making. He knew that a real father did not make his daughter afraid of her own family. He knew that a real father showed up, not with threats and surveillance and legal maneuvers, but with patience and presence and love that expected nothing in return. The line was silent for a long moment. Then Marcus hung up without another word. Rachel had been standing in the doorway, listening. Her face was unreadable, a mixture of fear and hope and something else, something that might have been admiration. Caleb put his phone back in his pocket and returned to the dishes. Neither of them mentioned the call again that night, but something had changed between them. Some invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer stranger and guest. They were something closer to allies. Sunday passed quietly, a pause in the storm that everyone knew was temporary. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, painting everything in soft gold. The children played in the backyard, chasing each other around the old oak tree that Caleb had climbed as a boy, that his father had climbed before him. Their laughter echoed across the yard like music. Rachel sat on the porch and watched them, her phone silent for once, her body slowly unclenching from the tension she had carried for weeks. Caleb worked on repairing a section of fence that the storm had damaged, his movements methodical and sure. In the afternoon, Lucy came running up to him with a dandelion clutched in her small hand, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that only children can sustain. She asked him to help her make a wish. Caleb knelt down and held the flower steady while Lucy squeezed her eyes shut, concentrating with her whole body. She blew. The seeds scattered across the yard like tiny parachutes, catching the breeze and floating toward the sky. Lucy opened her eyes and smiled. It was the first real smile Caleb had seen from her since they arrived, and it broke something open in his chest. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the brief respite of Sunday already forgotten. Rachel had been up since 5, going over documents with her lawyer on the phone, her voice low and urgent in the kitchen. Caleb made breakfast for everyone, maintaining normalcy for the sake of the children, who sensed the tension but did not understand its source. At 9 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up in front of the house. 2 men in suits stepped out, their faces professionally blank. Behind them, a silver Mercedes parked at the curb with surgical precision. Marcus Whitmore emerged from the driver's seat. He was taller than Caleb had imagined, with the kind of physical presence that came from expensive gyms and custom-tailored suits, and the absolute confidence of a man who had never been told no. His hair was silver at the temples, distinguished in a way that probably impressed judges and juries. His face was carefully neutral, betraying nothing. He walked up the front path as if he owned the property, as if this confrontation had been scheduled on his calendar for weeks and everything was proceeding according to plan. The 2 men in suits stayed by the car, watching, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses. Rachel stepped onto the porch before Marcus reached the steps. Her posture had changed. The fear that had hunched her shoulders for days, that had made her flinch at every phone call and jump at every shadow, was gone. She stood straight, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting her ex-husband's without flinching. Something in her had hardened overnight, forged in the fire of that phone call she had overheard, in the image of an ordinary man standing up to a powerful one. She told Marcus he was not welcome here. She told him that whatever he wanted to say could be said in court, in front of a judge, with lawyers present to ensure that words were chosen carefully. Marcus smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had always gotten what he wanted and saw no reason why this situation should be different. He said he just wanted to see his daughter. He said he had rights guaranteed by law, rights that no small-town electrician could obstruct without consequences. He said that the people inside this house were interfering with those rights, and interference had costs. Lucy appeared in the doorway behind her mother. She was holding Ethan's hand, their fingers intertwined. Both children looked confused and frightened by the strange man on the lawn, by the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Marcus called to Lucy in a voice that was probably meant to sound warm, but came out possessive, hungry. He told her that Daddy was here. He told her to come give him a hug. Lucy pressed closer to Ethan and did not move. Her small body trembled. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. The mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath, the fury of a man whose possessions were not obeying. He took a step toward the porch. Caleb moved then. He had been standing near the fence, pretending to check the cameras, but he crossed the yard in seconds and positioned himself between Marcus and the steps. His voice was calm when he spoke, calmer than he felt. He told Marcus that this was private property. He told Marcus that the police had been called and were on their way, that Deputy Tom would arrive in approximately 7 minutes. He told Marcus that everything happening right now was being recorded by the security cameras that Marcus could see at each corner of the house. He pointed to the neighbors who had gathered on their porches, watching. Mrs. Patterson with her arms crossed. The Rodriguez family from across the street. Mr. Rodriguez holding his phone up to record. Tom's wife, on her own porch, clearly taking video. Marcus looked around at the audience that had assembled, at the small-town solidarity that he had not anticipated and could not buy. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. One of the men by the car said something about leaving and returning with proper legal authority, about not giving anyone ammunition for the hearing. Marcus straightened his tie, a gesture that was probably meant to look controlled but came across as defeat. He looked at Rachel with an expression of pure venom. The mask fully dropped now, revealing the man underneath. He told her this was not over. He told her she would regret making this difficult, that he had resources she could not imagine, connections that reached into places she did not even know existed. Then he turned and walked back to his car, his steps stiff with barely contained rage. The black sedan followed the Mercedes down the street and around the corner into whatever darkness had spawned them. Rachel's knees buckled the moment the cars were out of sight. Caleb caught her before she fell, his arms steady around her shoulders. She was shaking, the adrenaline finally finding release. He helped her sit down on the porch steps and sat beside her, saying nothing, just being present. The custody hearing took place that afternoon in the county courthouse, a building that had stood for 100 years and seen every kind of human drama within its walls. Rachel's lawyer, Gerald, had managed to file a counter-motion, arguing that Marcus's emergency petition was based on false premises, that there had been no kidnapping, only a mother exercising her legal right to travel with her child within the custody agreement's parameters. The security footage from Caleb's cameras was submitted as evidence. The video of Marcus's confrontation, including his threatening language and his aggressive approach toward the house where children were present, was shown to the judge. 3 of Caleb's neighbors provided written statements describing what they had witnessed. Tom's wife contributed her cell phone recording, which captured Marcus's exact words when his mask had slipped. The judge, a 60-year-old woman named Eleanor Sampson, who had been presiding over family court for 25 years and had seen every manipulation and lie that wealthy parents could devise, watched the footage without expression. When it finished, she looked at Marcus with undisguised contempt. She had seen his type before. Men who believed their money made them above the law, above the basic decency that ordinary people practiced without thinking. She denied his emergency motion. She ordered a full investigation into his use of private investigators to harass the mother of his child. She noted that his behavior at a private residence, in front of his daughter and other children, demonstrated a concerning lack of judgment that called into question his fitness as a parent. She scheduled a review hearing in 6 weeks to reassess the custody arrangement. Until then, primary custody would remain with Rachel. Marcus's lawyer objected, citing precedent and procedure and all the tricks of his expensive trade. The judge overruled him with visible satisfaction. Marcus stood in the courtroom with his expensive suit and his silver Mercedes waiting outside and his army of investigators, and he lost. The weeks that followed were complicated, as all periods of transition are. Media coverage of the custody dispute painted an unflattering picture of Marcus, and business partners who had once competed for his attention began quietly distancing themselves. Rachel took a leave of absence from her position as CEO to focus on Lucy, to rebuild the relationship that the stress of the past 2 years had strained. She appointed her VP of Operations as interim leader and promised to return when things stabilized, when she could give the company the attention it deserved. Lucy started attending the local elementary school with Ethan. The 2 children had become inseparable, bonded by the trauma they had shared and the resilience they had discovered in each other. They sat together on the bus every morning. They ate lunch at the same table. They did their homework side by side at Caleb's kitchen counter while Rachel and Caleb sat on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Rachel and Lucy did not return to the house on the hill. The 7 bedrooms and 3-car garage felt wrong now, full of memories she was trying to escape, echoes of a life that no longer fit. Instead, she rented a small apartment near downtown, close enough to Caleb's house that the children could walk between them. She learned to cook simple meals, burning rice and overcooking pasta, laughing at her own failures. She learned the names of Ethan's teachers and the rules of whatever video game the children were currently obsessed with. She attended school events and soccer games, sitting in the bleachers like every other parent. Nobody special, just Lucy's mom. Caleb returned to his normal routine, taking electrical jobs around town, maintaining his house, raising his son. But something had changed in him too. He found himself looking forward to the afternoons when Lucy would run into his kitchen, full of stories about her day. He found himself lingering at school pickup, making conversation with Rachel about nothing in particular, about the weather and the children's grades and the shows they were watching on television. He found himself thinking about her when he should have been thinking about circuit breakers and wire gauges. One evening, after the children were in bed, Rachel appeared on his porch. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, no makeup, no armor. She looked like someone he might have known his whole life. She thanked him again for everything. She said she did not know how to repay him. Caleb shrugged. He told her she did not owe him anything, but Rachel shook her head. She said that was not what she meant. She said that she had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Money, influence, access to her connections, and her power. She had learned to read agendas in every conversation, to calculate the cost of every relationship, and then she had knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of a storm, and that stranger had opened it without asking for anything in return. She said that changed something inside her. She said she did not know what it meant yet, but she wanted to find out. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The porch light caught the gold in her hair. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. He told her that he was not good at talking about feelings, that words had never been his strength. He told her that he had been alone for 7 years and had forgotten how to be anything else. But he said that if she wanted to have dinner sometime, just the two of them, he knew a place in town that made decent lasagna. Rachel smiled. It was not the practiced smile of a CEO in a boardroom. It was something private and fragile and real. She said she would like that very much. 3 months later, spring had arrived in Cedar Falls. The trees were budding along Main Street. The air smelled like rain and new grass and possibility. Rachel had returned to Whitmore Industries on a reduced schedule, 3 days a week, leaving the daily operations to her capable team. Marcus had accepted a revised custody agreement that gave him supervised visitation twice a month. He had not challenged it. His lawyers had advised him that any further legal action would only make things worse, that he had lost the public relations battle and could not recover. Lucy was thriving. She had made friends at school, real friends who did not care about her last name or her mother's company. She no longer flinched when the phone rang. She had stopped asking when they were going back to the big house on the hill. This was home now. On a Saturday afternoon in April, Caleb was teaching Ethan how to change the oil in the truck when Rachel and Lucy walked up the driveway. Lucy was carrying a basket of muffins she had helped her mother bake, proud of her creation despite the lopsided frosting. Rachel was carrying something else, a thick envelope that she handed to Caleb without explanation. Inside was the deed to her old house. She had put it on the market. She was donating the proceeds to the children's hospital where Ethan had been born and where Caleb's wife Sarah had died. She said she wanted something good to come from that place, wanted the money to help other families facing the worst days of their lives. She said she was done with houses that were too big for the people living in them. Caleb looked at the deed. He looked at Rachel. He looked at the 2 children who were already running toward the backyard, arguing about who could climb the oak tree faster. Then he did something he had not done in 7 years. He reached out and took Rachel's hand. They stood there in the driveway, two people who had survived their own storms, watching their children play in the afternoon light. Nothing was certain. The future stretched ahead of them, full of complications and possibilities they could not yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them was facing it alone. The house behind them needed painting. The truck needed new brakes. There were dishes in the sink and laundry that would not fold itself, and 1,000 ordinary problems waiting to be solved. But Caleb had learned something important in the past few months. He had learned that the storms that destroyed things could also create them, that a door opened on a terrible night could lead to mornings worth waking up for, that a home was not a building or an address. It was the people you let inside, the ones you chose to trust with your fear and your hope and the soft parts of yourself that you had kept hidden for too long. Rachel leaned against his shoulder. Her hand was warm in his. Down by the oak tree, Lucy's laughter rang out across the yard, mixing with Ethan's, rising into the clear spring air like a promise, like a beginning, like something finally, at long last, coming home.